December 19, 1944. The Ardennes Forest, Belgium. 6:47 a.m. The world through a telescopic sight reduces itself to a circle. Everything outside that circle ceases to exist. There is only the target, the breath, the heartbeat slowing to nothing between shots. Corporal Hans Becker had been lying in the same position for 7 hours, his body pressed into frozen earth behind a fallen oak tree, and in all that time he had not moved more than an inch. His fingers, wrapped in woolen mitts with the trigger finger cut away, had gone numb 3 hours ago. He could no longer feel the cold metal of the Carabiner 98K's trigger against his skin. He navigated by memory now, by muscle response trained through 4,000 practice shots at the sniper school in Grafenwöhr. The rifle was an extension of his nervous system. When he thought about firing, his body knew how to make it happen. Through the Zeiss ZF-42 scope mounted on his rifle, Becker watched American soldiers moving through the village of Rocherath 400 meters below his position. They moved with the exhaustion of men who had been fighting for days without rest. The 99th Infantry Division had been holding this sector since the German offensive began 3 days earlier, and every man Becker could see through his scope bore the marks of sustained combat. The Ardennes offensive, what the Americans would later call the Battle of the Bulge, had caught Allied forces completely by surprise. Hitler's last desperate gamble to split the American and British armies, to drive to Antwerp and change the course of the war. For 3 days, Becker's regiment had been pushing west, and for 3 days he had been doing his job with mechanical precision. 17 confirmed kills since December 16, 17 Americans who had been alive in the morning and dead by nightfall because Becker had aligned his crosshairs, controlled his breathing, and squeezed the trigger with exactly 4.5 pounds of pressure. He didn't think about them as men with families, hopes, fears. They were targets. Eliminating them was his function. This was how you stayed sane in war. The morning light was changing, dawn creeping across the frozen landscape like an unwelcome guest. Becker preferred darkness, the moments just before sunrise when shadows offered maximum concealment and targets were silhouetted against the growing light. But the village below was waking up despite the war, and American soldiers were emerging from buildings where they'd spent the night. Becker's spotter, Private Dieter Koch, lay beside him with a pair of 10 by 50 binoculars pressed to his face. Koch was 19 years old, transferred from the regular infantry 6 weeks ago because he had good eyesight and didn't panic under fire. He'd never wanted to be a sniper. He'd wanted to drive trucks in the supply corps. Instead, he was lying in frozen mud watching men die through magnified lenses. Movement at the church, Koch whispered, his breath condensing in small clouds. 2 soldiers. 1 carrying medical supplies. Becker shifted his aim, a microscopic adjustment that took 3 seconds of controlled movement. His crosshairs found the church, a small stone building with a damaged steeple where German artillery had taken the top off 2 days earlier. 2 American soldiers emerged from the side entrance. 1 carried a canvas bag marked with a red cross. The other walked beside him, rifle slung over his shoulder. The medic. The word formed in Becker's mind automatically. Under the Geneva Conventions, medical personnel were not legitimate military targets. Shooting a medic was a war crime. But Becker had seen enough of the war to know that rules became negotiable under certain circumstances. German snipers had standing orders to eliminate any high-value target that presented itself. A medic keeping American soldiers alive could be considered a legitimate target under operational necessity. Becker had killed medics before. 3, to be exact. He'd killed them because command doctrine said that eliminating enemy medical personnel degraded combat effectiveness more efficiently than killing common soldiers. A wounded soldier required 2 or 3 men to evacuate him. A dead medic meant more soldiers would die from their wounds. It was strategic arithmetic. It was what you did to win. But something about this particular morning made Becker hesitate. Through his scope, he watched the medic and his companion moving through the village. They weren't rushing. They weren't acting like men under threat. They were simply walking, 2 soldiers on a cold morning, probably hungry, probably scared, probably missing home. The medic stopped to adjust his bag. Becker could see his face clearly now through the 4x magnification of his scope. Young. Maybe 22 or 23. Dark hair visible under his helmet. He was smiling at something his companion had said. Laughing, actually. A brief moment of human connection in the middle of hell. Range 380 meters, Koch murmured, feeding Becker the information he needed. Wind negligible. No adjustment needed. Becker's crosshairs centered on the medic's chest. The standard aiming point for a torso shot. Reliable. Fatal. The medic was still laughing at whatever his friend had said, and Becker could almost imagine the conversation. Something about coffee, probably. Or mail from home. The small things soldiers talk about to remember they're still human. Becker had been trained at Grafenwöhr for 6 months before being sent to the Eastern Front. The instructors there had been precise, methodical men who taught that a sniper's greatest weapon was his ability to detach emotionally from his targets. "You are not a soldier," his instructor, a scarred veteran from the First World War, had said. "You are a precision instrument. The rifle is your tool. The enemy is raw material to be processed." The training had worked. On the Eastern Front, Becker had killed 43 Soviet soldiers in 5 months. He'd killed them from positions they never suspected, at ranges they didn't think were possible. He'd killed them while they ate breakfast, while they smoked cigarettes, while they wrote letters home. He'd killed them and felt nothing because feeling anything would have destroyed him. But now, with his crosshairs on this American medic's chest, something was different. The light, perhaps. The morning sun breaking through the winter clouds. Or maybe it was exhaustion. 7 hours without moving. 3 days without sleep. The human mind does strange things when pushed beyond its limits. Through his scope, Becker watched the medic continue his walk through the village. The man stopped at a damaged house, called out, received an answer from inside. He entered the building. Becker could have fired then, a shot through the doorway before the target disappeared inside. Easy. Certain. But he didn't. "Why didn't you shoot?" Koch asked, his voice barely audible. Becker didn't answer. He kept his eye pressed to the scope, watching the doorway where the medic had disappeared. He told himself he was waiting for a better shot. Waiting for the target to re-emerge in better light, with a clearer background. These were the things you considered for maximum effectiveness. But the truth was something else. The truth was that Becker had killed 60 men in 7 months of war, and somewhere in the accumulated weight of those deaths, something had shifted. Not broken. Not failed. Just shifted. Like a piece of machinery moving slightly out of alignment, still functional but producing different results. The village below continued its morning routine. American soldiers moved between buildings. Somewhere, coffee was being made. Rations were being distributed. Men were trying to survive another day. And Becker lay in his hide, his rifle aimed at nothing in particular, thinking about a medic who had laughed at a joke while walking through a war zone. The German offensive was stalling. Becker didn't need intelligence reports to know this. He could read it in the movement patterns below, in the way American soldiers were consolidating positions rather than retreating. The surprise was gone. The momentum was fading. In a few days, maybe a week, the offensive would collapse entirely and German forces would be pushed back. And when that happened, what would matter? How many men Becker had killed? Or how many he'd chosen not to kill? These were dangerous thoughts. Thoughts that got soldiers court-martialed. Thoughts that suggested weakness, moral failure, inability to perform one's duty. Becker pushed them away. He focused on his breathing, on his position, on the professional discipline that had kept him alive this long. The medic emerged from the building 30 minutes later. He was carrying a wounded soldier, his arm around the man's waist, supporting his weight. Another American soldier helped from the other side. They moved slowly, carefully, trying not to jostle the wounded man who was clearly in significant pain. Becker's crosshairs found the medic again. Center mass. Perfect shot. The man was moving slowly enough that leading the target would be minimal. One squeeze of the trigger. One more name in the ledger. One more small contribution to Germany's increasingly desperate war effort. But Becker didn't fire. He watched the 3 men move across the village square. The medic was talking to the wounded soldier, probably offering reassurance, probably lying about how everything would be fine. The things medics say to dying men. Hans, Koch whispered, using Becker's first name for the first time since they'd been paired together. "What are we doing?" Becker still didn't answer. Through his scope, he watched the medic and his companions disappear into another building. The village settled into relative quiet. Smoke rose from chimneys. The war continued, indifferent to Becker's crisis of purpose. In the distance, artillery rumbled. American or German, impossible to tell. The sound of war was the sound of war, regardless of which side was shooting. Becker had been hearing it for so long that silence had become foreign to him. When the war ended, if he survived, what would he do with the silence? The sun climbed higher. Becker's position was becoming less tenable. As light increased, his concealment decreased. Standard sniper doctrine called for withdrawal before full daylight. But Koch had his binoculars trained on the village, and Becker kept his eye pressed to his scope, and neither of them moved. They were waiting for something. Neither knew exactly what. The first time Hans Becker killed a man, he vomited for 10 minutes afterward. This was in Russia, outside Smolensk, in October 1943. The target had been a Soviet officer examining a map near a burned-out village. Range, 220 meters. Clear shot. Becker had steadied his breathing, aligned his crosshairs, and squeezed the trigger with the mechanical precision his training had instilled. The officer had dropped instantly. Through his scope, Becker had watched the man's body crumple, watched other Soviet soldiers rush forward in confusion, watched them drag their officer's body into cover. And then Becker had rolled onto his side and emptied his stomach into the Russian mud while his spotter, a veteran named Ernst, had laughed and said, "Gets easier." Ernst had been right. It did get easier. By his 10th kill, Becker no longer vomited. By his 20th, he felt nothing at all. By his 40th, he could kill a man and immediately shift to the next target without pause. This was what training did. This was how humans adapted to doing the unthinkable. But Ernst had left out one crucial piece of information. It got easier until suddenly it didn't. Becker hadn't anticipated this moment. His training hadn't covered what happened when the mechanical precision of killing encountered something that broke through the emotional detachment. The sniper school at Grafenwöhr had taught him everything about ballistics, wind calculation, range estimation, camouflage, and field craft. But no one had taught him what to do when his crosshairs centered on a target and his finger refused to squeeze the trigger. The medic appeared again at 9:15 a.m., this time carrying his canvas bag toward the village's northern edge. Becker tracked him through the scope. The man moved with purpose now, not the relaxed pace of earlier. Something had changed. Probably casualties. The sound of small arms fire had been increasing for the past hour, suggesting that American and German forces were engaging somewhere beyond the village. "He's going toward the fighting," Koch observed. "Medical emergency, probably." Becker said nothing. His crosshairs followed the medic's progress across the square. The man was alone now, his companion from earlier nowhere in sight. A single target. No witnesses. The perfect shot a sniper dreams about. The medic stopped suddenly, looking up toward the tree line where Becker and Koch lay hidden. For one heart-stopping moment, Becker thought they'd been spotted. But the medic was simply scanning the area, professional caution in enemy territory. Then he continued moving, disappearing down a narrow street between damaged buildings. "We should move," Koch said quietly. "It's getting too light. Our position is compromised if anyone looks carefully." Koch was right. Standard operating procedure called for snipers to change positions every few hours, never staying in one place long enough to be located. But Becker couldn't move. Something held him in place, some compulsion to see what would happen next, as if the medic's survival depended on Becker maintaining his vigil. The sound of fighting intensified. Machine gun fire, punctuated by the deeper crack of rifle shots. The battle was moving closer to the village. Through his binoculars, Koch scanned the area, tracking movement patterns, identifying tactical developments. "American reinforcements," Koch reported. "Company strength, maybe more. Moving up from the south. If they continue at current pace, they'll be in the village in 30 minutes. Becker absorbed this information without emotion. 30 minutes meant they needed to withdraw now, before American soldiers overran their position. But still he didn't move. His eye remained pressed to the scope, waiting. The medic reappeared, running this time. Behind him, 2 soldiers carried a stretcher with a wounded man. The group moved with desperate urgency, trying to reach cover before German artillery found their range. Becker could see blood soaking through the blanket covering the wounded soldier on the stretcher. His crosshairs found the medic. The man was breathing hard, his face flushed with exertion. Becker could see sweat on his forehead despite the cold. The medic stumbled, caught himself, kept running. He was shouting instructions to the soldiers carrying the stretcher, coordinating their movement. Becker's finger rested on the trigger. 4.5 pounds of pressure. That's all it would take. Less effort than opening a door. Less force than picking up a coffee cup. Just a slight increase in pressure and the medic would die in the middle of his desperate run to save a wounded soldier. The arithmetic was clear. Kill the medic now, and the wounded man on the stretcher would probably die too. 2 casualties for 1 shot. Strategically optimal. Tactically sound. Exactly what sniper doctrine called for. But Becker's finger didn't move. Hans, Koch's voice carried a note of urgency now. American patrols. 200 meters south. We need to withdraw immediately. Becker heard the words but couldn't process them. Through his scope, he watched the medic and the stretcher bearers reach cover, disappearing into a building. Safe. At least for now. Becker's crosshairs swept across empty space where the target had been. Now, Hans. We go now. Koch was already gathering their equipment, preparing to withdraw. In his voice was the first hint of panic. They'd been in position too long. The tactical situation had evolved beyond their ability to control it. Staying meant capture or death. Becker pulled his eye away from the scope. The sudden absence of that circular window onto the world was disorienting. For 7.5 hours, he'd been looking at reality through 4x magnification, and now the full spectrum of his surroundings crashed back into awareness. The cold he'd stopped noticing. The ache in his muscles from hours of immobility. The taste of fear in his mouth. They withdrew in silence, moving through the forest with the practiced stealth of experienced snipers. Behind them, the sound of fighting grew louder. The American reinforcements Koch had spotted were engaging German positions. The offensive was collapsing, sector by sector, as Allied forces responded to the surprise attack. Becker and Koch moved for 2 hours, putting distance between themselves and the advancing American forces. They found a temporary position on a hillside overlooking a supply route, set up their equipment, and settled in to wait for targets of opportunity. But Becker's mind wasn't on the road below. He kept seeing the medic's face through his scope. The laugh. The urgency as he ran to help the wounded. The complete absorption in his duty to save lives while Becker had held the power to end his. Why didn't you shoot? Koch asked, breaking the silence they'd maintained since withdrawing. You had clear shots. Multiple opportunities. Becker didn't answer immediately. He didn't have an answer. Or rather, he had several answers, none of which made sense when spoken aloud. He'd hesitated because the medic was laughing. Because the man was saving lives while Becker was taking them. Because somewhere in the mathematics of killing, an equation had stopped balancing. Tactical reasons, Becker finally said. Shot angles weren't optimal. Risk of compromising position was too high. Koch didn't respond, but Becker could feel the younger man's skepticism. They both knew those were lies. The shots had been perfect. The position had been secure. Becker had chosen not to fire for reasons that had nothing to do with tactics. The day wore on. Other targets appeared on the road below. German supply trucks. Motorcycle couriers. Once, a staff car that probably carried officers. Becker tracked them all through his scope but didn't fire. Koch watched in silence, not questioning, not understanding, just witnessing something shifting in his partner. At dusk, they withdrew again, making their way back toward German lines. The Ardennes offensive was falling apart. Becker could see it in the movement of troops, in the increasing desperation of German positions, in the way American forces were methodically pushing forward. Hitler's gamble had failed. The war was lost. Everyone knew it, even if saying so meant execution. They reached friendly lines after dark. Reported to their commanding officer, a major named Holst who looked like he hadn't slept in a week. Holst barely acknowledged their presence, just waved them toward the makeshift barracks where exhausted soldiers were trying to rest. Becker lay on a rough wooden bunk, staring at the ceiling. Around him, other soldiers snored, talked in their sleep, shifted restlessly. The sounds of men trying to escape the war through unconsciousness. But Becker couldn't sleep. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw the medic through his scope. What would have happened if he'd fired? The medic would have died, certainly. The wounded soldier on the stretcher might have died too. Other soldiers might have died later when the medic wasn't there to save them. Becker's kill count would have increased. The war would have continued exactly as it had been continuing. But something else would have changed. Something in Becker himself. He'd killed 60 men, but they'd all been soldiers. Combatants. People whose job was to kill him if they got the chance. The medic was different. The medic's job was to save lives. Killing him would have crossed a line Becker hadn't realized existed until he stood at the edge of it. The next morning, Major Holst summoned Becker and Koch to a briefing. The major's face was grave, his uniform rumpled from days of continuous wear. Maps covered the table in front of him, marked with red and blue pencils showing German and American positions. The offensive is finished, Holst said without preamble. We're transitioning to defensive operations. Your orders are to provide overwatch on the withdrawal routes, eliminate high-value targets, slow American advance. You understand? Becker nodded. Koch nodded. Standard orders. The same mission they'd been performing for months, just in a different direction. Retreat instead of advance. Delay instead of attack. The semantics of losing. One more thing, Holst added, his eyes fixing on Becker. I've been reviewing engagement reports. Your kill rate has dropped significantly in the past 48 hours. Is there a problem with your equipment? With your effectiveness? Becker felt Koch tense beside him. The question was dangerous. Suggesting that a sniper had lost his effectiveness was the first step toward reassignment, court-martial, or worse. In a war that was being lost, commanders had little patience for soldiers who couldn't perform their duties. No problem, sir, Becker replied, keeping his voice steady. Tactical situation hasn't provided optimal opportunities. Target-rich environments have decreased as American forces consolidated positions. Holst studied him for a long moment, his expression unreadable. Then he nodded. See that you make better use of opportunities going forward. Dismissed. Outside the command post, Koch grabbed Becker's arm. Hans, what's happening to you? The major knows something's wrong. If you can't do the job anymore, tell me. I'll request reassignment before this gets us both shot. Becker pulled his arm free. I can do the job. I've always done the job. But you didn't. Yesterday. You had clear shots on multiple high-value targets and you took none of them. That's not tactical. That's something else. Koch was right, and Becker knew it. But acknowledging the truth meant confronting something he wasn't ready to confront. Something about the mechanics of killing and the weight of accumulated death and the moment when a human being recognizes that he's become something he never intended to become. The medic, Koch said quietly. It was the medic, wasn't it? You couldn't kill the medic. Becker didn't answer. In the distance, artillery rumbled. The war continued, indifferent to personal crises. They spent the next 3 days in a series of temporary positions, providing overwatch as German forces withdrew westward. The Ardennes offensive had collapsed completely. What had begun as Hitler's last desperate gamble to change the war's trajectory had devolved into a chaotic retreat, German units falling back under relentless American pressure. Becker performed his duties with mechanical efficiency. He tracked targets through his scope. He calculated ranges, adjusted for wind and elevation, controlled his breathing. But his finger remained frozen on the trigger. For 3 days, he didn't fire a single shot. Koch stopped asking why. The younger man simply did his job as a spotter, calling out ranges and targets, maintaining their equipment, keeping watch. But the silence between them grew heavy with unspoken questions. Whatever was happening to Becker, Koch was witnessing something neither of them understood. On the 4th day, they received new orders. An American reconnaissance patrol had been spotted moving through a forest sector southwest of their position. Intelligence suggested the patrol might include a forward observer directing artillery fire. The order was explicit: eliminate the forward observer before he could call in strikes on the withdrawal route. Becker and Koch moved into position at dawn. They found a suitable hide on a hillside overlooking a logging road. According to intelligence reports, the American patrol would pass this point sometime before noon. Standard ambush scenario. Wait for the target, identify the forward observer, eliminate him before he realized he was in danger. The patrol appeared at 10:15 a.m. 8 American soldiers moving cautiously through the forest, weapons ready, eyes scanning for threats. They moved with the practiced wariness of experienced troops who knew that death could come from any direction without warning. Through his scope, Becker examined each soldier methodically. The first was carrying a bar, the Browning automatic rifle that American infantry squads used for suppressive fire. The second and third were standard riflemen. The fourth soldier carried a radio on his back and walked beside a man with map and compass. The forward observer. Becker's target. Range, 310 meters. Wind, minimal. Clear shot. Perfect conditions. Target identified, Koch whispered. Fourth in line. The one with the radio. Becker's crosshairs found the forward observer. Young, maybe 24 or 25. He was talking to the soldier beside him, probably coordinating their route. Every few seconds, he'd glance at his watch, likely checking their timing against a predetermined schedule. This man was different from the medic. This man's job was to call down artillery fire on German positions. His presence on the battlefield actively contributed to German casualties. Eliminating him was strategically justified, tactically necessary, and morally defensible under the rules of war. Becker's finger rested on the trigger. 4.5 pounds of pressure. But he couldn't do it. His finger wouldn't move. It was as if some fundamental connection between his brain and his trigger finger had been severed. The mechanics still worked, he could feel the metal under his fingertip, could sense the tension in the trigger spring. But the will to compress that final distance had evaporated. Hans, Koch's voice carried a note of desperation now. The target is in optimal range. If you wait, they'll move past and we'll lose the opportunity. Becker knew this. Every second of hesitation decreased the likelihood of a successful shot. The patrol was moving steadily, would soon be past the point of optimal engagement. But his finger remained motionless. Through his scope, Becker watched the forward observer laugh at something his companion said. Another laugh. Was this what had broken him? The recognition that his targets were capable of laughter. That they were human beings with the same capacity for joy and fear and hope that he possessed. The patrol moved past. 8 American soldiers continued down the logging road, unaware that death had been watching them through a telescopic sight. Koch lowered his binoculars, his face a mask of confusion and fear. We need to report back, Koch said. Tell command that the patrol passed through. They'll send another team to intercept. No. Becker's voice surprised him with its firmness. We'll report that weather conditions prevented positive identification. Fog in the valley. Limited visibility. There's no fog. Command will know we're lying. Then let them know. Becker pulled his eye away from the scope, looked directly at Koch. I won't kill them. I can't. Koch stared at him with a mixture of horror and something else. Understanding, perhaps. Or recognition of something he'd been feeling himself but hadn't dared to acknowledge. You've broken, Koch said softly. The war has broken you. Becker considered this. Was he broken? Or was he finally operating correctly? He'd killed 60 men. He'd functioned as a precision instrument, exactly as his training had intended. But somewhere in that accumulation of death, something essential had reasserted itself. Some part of his humanity that training and necessity and fear had suppressed but couldn't eliminate entirely. Maybe, Becker replied. Or maybe I've just remembered who I was before the war taught me to be someone else. They withdrew from their position and made their way back toward German lines. Becker composed his report carefully, describing visibility conditions that hadn't existed and tactical complications that were pure fiction. The lies came easily. He'd been lying to himself for months about what he was doing. Lying to command was comparatively simple. Major Holst read the report with obvious skepticism. His eyes moved from the paper to Becker's face and back to the paper. Corporal Becker, Holst said slowly, your recent performance has been concerning. Multiple failed engagements. Opportunities missed. I'm beginning to question your fitness for sniper duties. Becker stood at attention, saying nothing. Court-martial seemed likely. Perhaps even execution for dereliction of duty. The German military in 1944 had little patience for soldiers who couldn't perform their assigned functions. But Holst surprised him. The major set down the report and leaned back in his chair, his face showing exhaustion deeper than physical fatigue. "How many men have you killed, Becker?" 60 confirmed kills, sir. 7 probables. 60 men. Holst repeated the number as if tasting something bitter. "And now you find you can't kill anymore. Is that correct?" Becker hesitated. Admitting the truth meant the end of his effectiveness as a sniper. Possibly the end of his military career. Possibly the end of his life if Holst decided to make an example of him. But lying was becoming too exhausting to maintain. "Yes, sir. I can't do it anymore." Holst nodded slowly. "You want to know something, Corporal? I don't blame you. This war is lost. We're not fighting for victory anymore. We're fighting to delay the inevitable. And every man who dies in that delay is dying for nothing." The words hung in the air between them. Speaking such thoughts openly was treason. But Holst continued, his voice barely above a whisper. "I've sent hundreds of men to their deaths in the past 6 months. Given orders that I knew would result in casualties for no strategic gain. And every night, I see their faces. Every single face." He looked at Becker with something like recognition. 2 men who had crossed the same invisible line, who had discovered that the human capacity for killing had limits that training couldn't override. "I'm reassigning you," Holst said. "You and Private Koch. You'll be attached to the regimental supply section. No more frontline duties. No more killing." Becker felt something release in his chest. Relief mixed with shame. Relief that he wouldn't have to look through a scope again. Shame that he'd failed at the duty he'd been trained to perform. "Sir, Don't thank me." Holst cut him off. "I'm not being merciful. I'm being practical. A sniper who can't shoot is a liability. But you're both experienced soldiers, and we need experienced soldiers in every position. So you'll move supplies. Keep your head down. Try to survive until this nightmare ends." The reassignment went into effect immediately. Becker turned in his Carabiner 98K in scope, the tools that had defined his identity for the past 7 months. Without them, he felt strangely naked, as if he'd removed some essential part of himself. But also lighter. The weight of the rifle had been more than physical. Koch was reassigned with him, the 2 of them transferred together to the supply depot. They spent their days loading trucks, sorting ammunition, inventorying rations. Mundane work that soldiers typically complained about but which Becker found almost meditative in its simplicity. No one died because he loaded a truck correctly. No one survived because he sorted supplies efficiently. The moral arithmetic was simpler. But the war wasn't finished with him yet. On January 15, 1945, the supply depot came under American artillery fire. Shells began falling without warning, turning the organized chaos of the depot into actual chaos. Soldiers scattered, diving for cover as explosions tore through supply buildings and vehicle parks. Becker found himself in a drainage ditch beside Koch, both of them pressed flat as shrapnel whined overhead. Nearby, a ammunition truck had taken a direct hit and was burning fiercely, secondary explosions sending more shrapnel flying as individual rounds cooked off. Through the smoke and confusion, Becker saw them. 3 American soldiers, advancing cautiously through the depot. They'd either gotten separated from their unit or were part of a reconnaissance team exploiting the artillery barrage. They moved professionally, covering each other, weapons ready. And with them was a medic. The same medic Becker had seen through his scope 3 weeks earlier. He was certain of it. Same face, same canvas bag marked with a red cross, same purposeful movement. The medic who had laughed, who had run to save the wounded, who had survived because Becker's finger had refused to squeeze the trigger. The Americans were searching for wounded German soldiers. The medic knelt beside a German private who had been hit by shrapnel, already opening his medical bag, beginning treatment even though the soldier was technically his enemy. The 2 soldiers with him maintained security, scanning for threats. Becker had a weapon. A standard Carabiner 98K rifle without a scope, issued to him for basic defense. He could have fired. Should have fired. These were enemy soldiers in German-held territory. But his hands didn't move toward the rifle lying beside him in the ditch. Koch was watching him, waiting to see what he would do. The moment stretched out, suspended in the smoke and noise of the artillery barrage. The medic continued working on the wounded German soldier, speaking to him in broken German, probably telling him he would be fine, probably lying the way medics do. Then American artillery found its range on the depot's fuel storage. The resulting explosion was massive, a pillar of fire and black smoke that rose hundreds of feet into the winter sky. The shockwave knocked Becker flat, his ears ringing, his lungs struggling for air. When he could see again, the Americans were gone. Withdrawn in the chaos of the explosion. The wounded German soldier the medic had been treating was still alive, bandaged, his bleeding stopped. He looked at Becker with confused gratitude, clearly not understanding why an American medic had saved his life. Becker understood. The medic had made the same choice Becker had made. In a war that demanded killing, both of them had chosen mercy. Not because it was tactical. Not because it changed anything strategic. But because somewhere in the machinery of war, they'd both remembered they were human. The war ended 4 months later. Germany's surrender on May 7, 1945 came as no surprise to anyone who had been paying attention. The Third Reich had been collapsing for months, its defenses crumbling under pressure from both east and west. For Hans Becker, the end of the war meant the beginning of something more difficult than fighting, the accounting. He spent 2 months in a British POW camp near Calais, along with thousands of other German soldiers waiting to be processed and released. The camp was relatively humane by wartime standards. Adequate food, basic shelter, no systematic abuse. The British treated their prisoners according to Geneva Convention guidelines, which seemed almost surreal after years of total war. Becker had time to think in the camp. Too much time. The enforced idleness meant confronting everything he'd avoided confronting during the war. The 60 men he'd killed. The face of each one, preserved in memory with photographic clarity. The medic he hadn't killed and all the implications of that single moment of mercy. Other prisoners dealt with the war's end in various ways. Some celebrated survival. Some withdrew into depression. Some obsessively discussed where Germany had gone wrong, as if understanding the tactical and strategic failures could somehow justify the moral ones. Becker mostly kept to himself, declining invitations to join conversations about the war. But one evening, an older prisoner approached him. Hauptmann Werner, a company commander who had fought through the entire war from Poland in 1939 to the final collapse. Werner had the look of a man who had seen too much and survived too long. He sat beside Becker without invitation and lit a cigarette. "You're the sniper," Werner said. Not a question. Somehow word had spread through the camp about Becker's service. 60 kills, they say. Impressive. Becker said nothing. There was nothing impressive about killing 60 men. It was simply what he'd done. The technical execution of training and orders. You know what's strange? Werner continued, blowing smoke into the evening air. I commanded 180 men at the start of the war. By the end, I had 14 left. The rest were dead, wounded, missing, or captured. 166 men whose lives ended or changed forever under my command. And I remember every single one of their names. He flicked ash from his cigarette. I used to think that remembering them was my duty. That if I forgot their names, their deaths would be meaningless. But now I realize that remembering them is just another form of torture. The war is over, but I'm still fighting it every time I try to sleep. Becker understood. He'd been having the same dreams. Faces appearing in his scope. The medic laughing. The forward observer checking his watch. All the targets that became men when he looked at them long enough. How do you live with it? Becker asked. Knowing that the war was lost. That everyone who died, died for nothing. Werner was quiet for a long moment. I don't know yet. I'm still figuring that out. But I think the first step is accepting that you're asking the wrong question. What's the right question? Not how do you live with it. But what do you do with the fact that you survived when so many others didn't? That's the real question. That's what we have to figure out. Becker was released from the POW camp in August 1945. He returned to Germany with a discharge paper, a small amount of money, and no clear idea what to do next. His hometown of Münster had been heavily bombed. His family home was gone, destroyed in an Allied air raid in 1944. His parents had survived, relocated to his aunt's farm outside the city. The reunion was difficult. His mother cried when she saw him, held him like he might disappear if she let go. His father shook his hand formally, German stoicism making it impossible to express the relief he must have felt. They didn't ask what he'd done during the war. He didn't volunteer the information. Germany in August 1945 was a nation in shock. Cities lay in ruins. The economy had collapsed. Food was scarce. The full horror of what had been done in Germany's name was emerging, as Allied forces liberated concentration camps and the world learned about the Holocaust. The German people were confronting their collective responsibility for the regime they'd supported or at least tolerated. Becker found work as a construction laborer, helping to clear rubble and rebuild damaged buildings in Münster. Physical work that left him exhausted at the end of each day, which was preferable to having energy left over for thinking. He lived with his parents, saved what little money he earned, and tried not to dwell on the war. But the war wouldn't leave him alone. In September, he encountered Dieter Koch on a street in Münster. His former spotter had also returned home, also found work in construction. They stood awkwardly on the sidewalk, two men who had shared something profound but didn't know how to acknowledge it in peacetime. "Do you think about it?" Koch asked after several minutes of small talk. About what happened in the Ardennes. Becker didn't need to ask what Koch meant. Every day. Me too. Koch looked relieved, as if he'd been carrying this question for months. I keep wondering if we did the right thing. If letting those men live was. I don't know. Treason. Weakness. Or something else. Does it matter now? The war is over. Germany lost. Nothing we did or didn't do changed that. It matters to me. Koch's voice carried an edge of desperation. I need to understand what happened to us out there. Why we stopped being able to do our jobs. Becker had thought about this question extensively during his months in the POW camp. He developed a theory, though he wasn't sure if it was true or just a comforting fiction. I think we stopped because we started seeing them as human again. Once you see your enemy as human, killing them becomes murder instead of war. But all killing in war is murder, isn't it? We just call it something else to make it acceptable. Maybe. Or maybe there's a difference between killing someone who's trying to kill you, and killing someone who's just trying to survive. The medic wasn't a threat. He was saving lives. Killing him would have been murder even by the loosest definition of war. Koch thought about this. Do you regret it? Not killing him? No. Becker's answer came without hesitation. That's the one thing from the war I don't regret. Everything else, but not that. They parted ways after exchanging addresses, promising to stay in touch though both knew they probably wouldn't. Some experiences bind people together. Others are so intense that remaining in contact just reinforces memories both parties want to forget. The years passed. Germany rebuilt, slowly emerging from the ruins of the war. The economic miracle of the 1950s transformed the country from defeated nation to industrial powerhouse. Becker worked construction, eventually started his own small company. He married in 1952, a woman named Margot who had been a nurse during the war. She understood nightmares and sudden silences. They built a life together carefully, avoiding the topics that led to dark places. He never told her he'd been a sniper. She knew he'd fought in the war, had been on the Eastern Front and later in the Ardennes. But the specifics of what he'd done remained unspoken. Some truths were too heavy to share even with people you loved. In 1968, 23 years after the war's end, Becker received an unexpected letter. It came from an address in Wisconsin, United States. The sender's name was unfamiliar, Robert Hartmann. But the letter's contents made Becker's hands shake as he read. Hartmann was a medical doctor in Milwaukee. During the war, he'd been a combat medic with the 99th Infantry Division, stationed in Belgium during the Battle of the Bulge. He'd spent decades trying to track down German soldiers who had been in the Ardennes at the same time, and through a series of connections and coincidences, he'd located Becker. The letter was written in careful, formal German. Hartmann explained that he'd become convinced, over the years, that a German sniper had chosen not to kill him during the battle. He'd been in the crosshairs multiple times, he'd felt it, that unique sensation of being watched through a scope. But the shot never came. He wanted to know if Becker had been that sniper. Becker read the letter 3 times before showing it to Margot. She read it once, then looked at her husband with a mixture of surprise and recognition. "You were a sniper," she said. "Not a question." "Yes." "And this man, you could have killed him but didn't." "Yes." Margot was quiet for a long time. Then, "Are you going to write back?" Becker thought about this. What would he say? That yes, he'd been the sniper who chose mercy. That he'd spent 23 years wondering if that choice had mattered. That sometimes in his dreams he still saw the medic through his scope, still felt his finger frozen on the trigger. He wrote back. A short letter, formal in tone, confirming that he had been a sniper in the Ardennes, that he remembered seeing an American medic in his scope, that he had chosen not to fire. He didn't explain why. He wasn't sure he could. Hartmann's response came 6 weeks later, along with a photograph. The photograph showed Hartmann in 1944, young and wearing an American uniform with a medic's armband. The same face Becker had seen through his scope. Confirmation that memory wasn't playing tricks, that the moment had been real. The letter was longer than the first, more personal. Hartmann described his life after the war. Medical school. Marriage. Children. A career treating patients in Milwaukee. He wrote about the debt he felt he owed to the German sniper who had let him live. How that moment of mercy had allowed everything that came after. "You gave me my life," Hartmann wrote. "Not by taking action, but by choosing not to. I've tried to honor that gift by dedicating my medical career to saving others. I've delivered 847 babies over the past 23 years. I've performed hundreds of surgeries. I like to think that your choice that day has multiplied, that the lives touched by my medical practice are, in some sense, an extension of your mercy." Becker read this letter alone in his study, and for the first time since the war ended, he wept. Not from grief or guilt, but from a complicated emotion he couldn't name. Relief, perhaps. Or vindication. The knowledge that his moment of mercy had mattered, had created consequences beyond the immediate moment. They corresponded for years after that, Becker and Hartmann. Letters back and forth between Germany and America, 2 former enemies building an unlikely friendship based on a shared moment in the Ardennes. They never met in person. Some connections don't require physical proximity. In 1982, Hartmann sent a final letter. He was dying of lung cancer, had perhaps 6 months left. He wanted Becker to know that he'd lived a good life, a full life, because a German sniper had chosen mercy in December 1944. He wanted to say thank you one last time. Becker wrote back immediately, but Hartmann died before the letter could reach him. At the funeral, according to Hartmann's son who sent Becker a brief note, the doctor had specifically requested that the story of the German sniper be told. Not as a story of the war, but as a story of humanity persisting despite the war. Hans Becker lived until March 2003, dying peacefully at age 83 in the same house in Münster where he'd raised his children. In his final years, he'd begun speaking about his war experience more openly. Not seeking redemption or forgiveness, but simply acknowledging what had happened. He gave several interviews to historians researching the Battle of the Bulge. He spoke to school groups about the war, though he declined to glorify his service or reduce the complexity of moral choice to simple lessons. When students asked if he was a hero for not killing the medic, he was firm in his response, "I was not a hero. I was a soldier who killed 60 men before discovering I couldn't kill anymore. The moment I lowered my rifle wasn't heroism. It was the bare minimum of humanity reasserting itself." After Becker's death, his son found a letter among his father's papers. Unfinished, never sent, addressed to no one in particular. It appeared to have been written in the 1990s, decades after the war but still grappling with its implications. The letter read, "I have spent 50 years trying to understand what happened in the Ardennes on December 19, 1944. I have analyzed it from every angle. Tactical. Strategic. Moral. Psychological. And I still cannot fully explain why my finger froze on the trigger when it had operated smoothly 60 times before. Perhaps it was exhaustion. 7 hours in the same position can do strange things to a man's judgment. Perhaps it was the light. Something about the morning sun that day made everything feel more real, more consequent. Perhaps it was simple chance, a random fluctuation in brain chemistry that manifested as an inability to perform a familiar action. But I don't believe any of those explanations. I think what happened was much simpler and much more terrifying. I think I remembered, for one crucial moment, that I was human. That despite everything the war had done to me, despite the training and the indoctrination and the necessity of killing, some essential core of humanity remained intact. The medic was saving lives while I was taking them. The mathematics were simple. Killing him would make the world darker. Letting him live made it fractionally brighter. In a war where almost every action led to suffering and death, here was one action that didn't. And I took it. I don't know if this makes me moral or immoral. I don't know if letting one man live balances against the 60 I killed. The accounting doesn't work that way. You can't subtract mercy from murder and expect the equation to balance. But I know that Robert Hartmann lived. I know he saved hundreds of lives over his career. I know he had children and grandchildren, and those lives exist because I chose not to squeeze the trigger. That has to mean something. It has to count for something in the final reckoning. The war taught me to kill efficiently, emotionlessly, professionally. But that one moment in the Ardennes taught me something else. It taught me that refusing to kill, even when every tactical consideration suggests you should, can be its own kind of courage. Not the courage of action, but the courage of restraint. The letter ended there, mid-thought, as if Becker had been interrupted or had lost the thread of what he wanted to say. His son donated it to the archives at the German War Graves Commission, where it sits alongside millions of other documents from the Second World War. The story might have ended there, just another footnote in the vast literature of World War II. But in 2008, Hartmann's grandson, a documentary filmmaker named Michael Hartmann, produced a short film about his grandfather's experience. The film included interviews with German veterans, archival footage from the Battle of the Bulge, and dramatic recreations of the moment when a sniper chose mercy. The film won several awards at documentary festivals. But more significantly, it sparked a broader conversation about moral choice in wartime. About the moments when individual soldiers face decisions that transcend military necessity. About the human capacity for mercy even in contexts designed to eliminate it. Other stories emerged. Veterans from multiple wars came forward with their own experiences of choosing not to kill when they could have. A Vietnam sniper who had lowered his rifle when his target stopped to help a wounded comrade. A Iraq war gunner who had held fire when his target revealed himself to be a teenager, clearly terrified, clearly not a threat. These stories suggested that Becker's experience wasn't unique. That throughout the history of warfare, individual soldiers have experienced these moments when training and necessity collide with fundamental humanity, and humanity, sometimes, wins. Military historians began studying this phenomenon. They called it combat mercy, instances where combatants choose restraint despite tactical advantages. Research suggested these moments were more common than official histories acknowledged. Soldiers simply didn't report them because they involved admitting to failing to perform their duties. But the research also suggested something else. Soldiers who experienced these moments of combat mercy, who chose restraint when they could have killed, tended to have better psychological outcomes after the war. Lower rates of PTSD. Fewer nightmares. An easier time reintegrating into civilian life. As if the act of choosing mercy, even once, provided some protection against the moral injury that war inevitably inflicted. This research didn't make Becker's choice heroic. It didn't absolve him of the 60 men he had killed. But it did suggest that his moment of restraint had been more than personal weakness or tactical failure. It had been a fundamentally human response to an inhuman situation, and it had mattered not just for Robert Hartmann, but for Becker himself. Today, the story of Hans Becker and Robert Hartmann is taught at several military academies as a case study in combat ethics. Not as a lesson about when soldiers should or shouldn't kill, but as an exploration of the complicated moral terrain that warriors must navigate. The moment when a sniper lowered his rifle is presented not as a failure of duty but as a reminder that duty itself is more complex than simple obedience to orders. The German War Museum in Berlin has a small exhibit dedicated to the story. It includes Becker's unfinished letter, photographs of both men, and a detailed account of the events in the Ardennes. The exhibit's final panel poses a question to visitors: if you had been the sniper, what would you have done? There is no answer provided. Just the question, hanging in the air, forcing visitors to confront their own capacity for mercy or violence. Most people pass through quickly, uncomfortable with the implications. But some linger, staring at the photographs of Becker and Hartmann, thinking about the weight of that single choice. The crosshairs of a sniper scope reduce the world to a circle. Inside that circle is a human life, reduced to a target, an objective, a problem to be solved through the application of precise violence. But sometimes, if you look long enough, that target becomes a person again. And once you see them as a person, everything changes. Hans Becker saw an American medic laugh at a joke, run to save a wounded soldier, choose life in a context of death. And in that seeing, he remembered who he had been before the war taught him to be someone else. He remembered that he was human, capable of mercy even after killing had become routine. He lowered his rifle. And in that small gesture, in that moment of restraint, he reclaimed something the war had tried to take from him. Not innocence, that was lost irretrievably in the deaths of the 60 men who died in his scope. But humanity. The ability to choose mercy when mercy seemed impossible. That choice echoed forward through time. Through Robert Hartmann's medical career and the 847 babies he delivered and the hundreds of lives he saved. Through the conversations between former enemies who became unlikely friends. Through the example it set for other soldiers facing similar moments in other wars. Through the reminder it provided that even in war, even in the most extreme circumstances, individual human beings retain the capacity to choose. The mathematics of war are brutal and simple. Kill the enemy before they kill you. Eliminate threats. Achieve objectives through the application of overwhelming force. But Hans Becker discovered something that military doctrine doesn't account for. Sometimes the most important victories aren't measured in casualties inflicted or ground taken. Sometimes they're measured in the lives you choose not to take. December 19, 1944. The Ardennes Forest, Belgium. A German sniper positioned on a hillside above a small village watched an American medic through his telescopic sight. His crosshairs were centered on the target. His breathing was controlled. His finger rested on the trigger. Everything was perfect for the shot. But he didn't take it. And in that moment of restraint, in that choice to lower his rifle rather than fire it, Hans Becker proved that even in the machinery of industrial warfare, even in contexts designed to eliminate moral choice entirely, human beings retain the capacity to choose mercy. The medic lived. The sniper lived. Both men went on to have families, careers, decades of life that wouldn't have existed if Becker's finger had compressed that final 4.5 pounds of trigger pressure. The war ended. Germany rebuilt. America prospered. And somewhere in the vast accounting of World War II's casualties and consequences, one small entry read differently than most, one life spared. One moment of mercy. One choice that mattered. The crosshairs moved on to empty space. The rifle lowered. And a German corporal named Hans Becker began the long process of becoming human again, one unchosen shot at a time.